I have no idea how I managed to read 14 books this month. But I did, so I'm going to talk about them. Here are the books I read in July. First up is Isabel Weidner's Sterling Carat Gold. I did a proper video review on this that you can go watch. This is a book about a lot of things, but primarily it is a modern adaptation of Franz Kafka's The Trial, inspired by the politics of modern-day Britain. So, Brexit, anti-immigration policies, homophobia, transphobia, all of the terrible conservative political things that are going on in the UK right now, smushed together into a surreal and strange adaptation of The Trial in Isabel Weidner's trademark style, which is like nothing else, literally in the world. Nobody writes like they do. And I really need you to check this book out if you haven't already. Next up was my introduction to the works of Vivek Shraya, a Canadian trans woman who is a musician and a writer and a professor. Again, I have a video on this. I read both of these books. I'm Afraid of Men is a very, very short 80-page non-fiction manifesto / memoir about Vivek Shraya's experience with men throughout her entire life and why men are so toxic, intimidating, and frightening to her. And I related to it in a intense way. It is an incredible book, and I wish we hadn't sold it. But we sell a lot of things because we're nomads and we have to. But I do still have the subtweet. And the subtweet is, again, a really, really impactful book about the power and impact of social media on our lives and how we build our relationships with each other. And also how, regardless of how rich or famous you are, we are still at the mercy of social media and it can still eat away at our mental health. It's a novel about two musicians who are pretty similar people, but one becomes famous by doing a superior cover of the other one's song. And they slowly become best friends, but one manages to go on tour supporting a white girl and the other one doesn't. And it's about their relationship being strained by their fame and also by social media. And it's really fascinating. It's a very contemporary book that I hugely recommend. Next up is Cursed Bunny. Again, I've done a review of this. I've done a video, you can watch it. Cursed Bunny is a short story collection by Korean author Bora Chung, translated by Anton He, and it is fabulous. This is one of my favorite books published this year, especially as translated fiction goes. It is a short story collection of a blend of weird genre fiction. It starts off with a lot of weird body horror, almost comically strange, gross, disgusting body horror, and then it morphs and there is a science fiction story and a fantasy story that also acts as a kind of fable, parable thing. It branches so many genres. It does so much with, I think, 10 stories. Every single one is an exercise in a different genre of fiction. I cannot say enough good things about Cursed Bunny. Please, please. Something got stuck in my throat. Check this book out. I also did a video review of this. Variations by Juliet Jacks. Juliet Jacks is a British trans woman. She is... I don't know if calling her a trans activist is fair because we seem to throw that phrase out so often. If a trans woman writes something or does a piece of art or has a Twitter account, we call her an activist, and I'm not sure that's fair. But she's done a lot for the trans movement, trans rights, and trans representation in the UK. If you want to call that activism, you can. Variations is a collection of short stories, but they are all very, very closely and intimately inspired by real accounts of real people over the past 200-ish years in the UK. They move in chronological order from the early 19th century all the way up to today, the early 21st century. And they just document the lives of trans men and trans women as they have existed or tried to survive all the way through history. And they are all real people, but their accounts have been turned into fiction by Juliet Jacks. Every story here is slightly different. One is a film script. One is a series of letters going back and forth between people. One is an account that was then published in a newspaper. So they're very, very different styles, and they definitely read like non-fiction because they borderline are. Really, really good. This is Natasha Brown's Assembly. I featured this in a video about books by black women writers. This is a debut novel by a black British woman. It is a tiny little 100-page book, and it is about the invisible to some people, racist behavior of this country. Most white people, the government itself, proudly says there is no racism, there is no systemic racism in this country. Yes, there is. There is a lot of it, and it's baked into everything. We all have internalized racism that we have learned, these bad behaviors that we keep repeating over and over. We need to get better at educating ourselves. And this is a novel that tackles exactly that. Systemic, corporate, borderline invisible racism at a almost cellular level in the UK. It does all of this in 100 pages of fiction about a black woman who is in a relationship with a white boy from old conservative money, and it's about her relationship to her job, to her boyfriend, to his family. But I also personally found this very, very triggering. I am a hypochondriac, and that will play into another book I'm going to talk about in a second. And this book deals with disease a little bit as well, and that made it a difficult read for me. If you also struggle with conversations about disease, be careful. My hypochondria, by the way, I think was born out of this pandemic. I became very, very paranoid, very terrified of COVID very, very early on, even though I think I had it at one point before we even really knew what it was. But now I'm terrified of everything. I'm always worried about getting sick. I have real health anxiety. I keep calling it hypochondria. We typically now call it health anxiety. Whatever it is, I have it, unfortunately. That will be relevant again in a minute. The next book that I want to talk about, I don't have anymore because I got it out of the library and I've since given it back to the library, and that is Transcendent Kingdom by Ya Gyasi. This book is everywhere. Most people have read it. Her debut novel, Homegoing, was a very, very big deal. Transcendent Kingdom, equally so. And it is a real genuine masterpiece of modern-day literary fiction from the US about Black lives, about the Black experience, about migration, about religion, about family, about what migration, religion, and capitalism does to family dynamics. It does so much so well while feeling like non-fiction, because partly it is inspired by the real lived experiences of Ya Gyasi, but also just because she writes these characters with such a clear intimacy that it's impossible not to feel like they are real. These are some of the most well-imagined people that I've read in a novel this year. It is amazing to me how well Ya Gyasi characterizes her people in her books. They are better realized than most writers could ever dream of doing to their characters, and that is one of her best selling points. They're entirely real people. They felt more real than me. I felt like I knew them better than I know myself, while also being a fascinating book about religion versus science, about migration and racism in 20th and 21st century America. The next book I read was this, The Animals at Lockwood Manor by Jane Healey. This was a debut novel, I think, and I picked it up. I bought it from Lighthouse Books. Lighthouse Books in Edinburgh. I wanted to support them. Something happened and I wanted to buy something from them, and I saw that they had this and I had seen it around and I thought, yeah, I'll pick this up. And it's okay. I love historical fiction, especially British historical fiction from around the 18th and 19th centuries. That is my jam. I really enjoy it. And that's kind of what this is, although it's actually set a little bit later. It's set in 1939 at the brink of World War II, where all of the museums in London, and I think this did actually happen, they moved everything out of the museums and into stately homes all around the countryside in England to try and keep them safe from bombings and attacks on the city. And so all of the animals of the Natural History Museum, all of the taxidermies and skeletons, get moved to this place called Lockwood Manor, and this woman who works for the museum has to go to Lockwood Manor to look after and curate all of the stuff, but Lockwood Manor is owned and run by a family, mostly a father and daughter. The father is a really toxic, horrible person, and the daughter is very, very fragile after losing her mother and having obviously a very bad relationship with her dad. And it's about mainly the relationship between that daughter and our protagonist, who is the museum curator. And it's okay. Everything on its surface seems fine. It's very, very derivative though. You can see the influences from Sarah Waters' novels, which I'll come to in a second. Jane Eyre, which I'll mention now I'm about to reread. There's a lot of clear influences here. Jane Eyre especially, and a lot of recent historical fiction. This book does feel kind of derivative, but it's not bad in any way. It's still a worthwhile read in its own right. It's just certainly not the best historical fiction that I've read ever. But if you like historical fiction, you like the sound of this, it is not a bad read. You know, it is a middle-of-the-road okay book. Possibly my favourite book that I read this month is The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Dalila Harris. This is another debut novel by another black woman writer. I'm going to be featuring it in another video soon, but I do have a video dedicated primarily to this book that you can go watch now. This is amazing. It toes a line between being genre fiction, a kind of mystery thriller, and literary fiction. And I was talking to my friend Rachel about this recently. This book has repeatedly been called The Devil Wears Prada meets Get Out. And I said that in my video as well. And Rachel and I were laughing because she said that that description is almost too accurate. This book is literally The Devil Wears Prada meets Get Out. Like, that is such an apt description that it's almost not fair. But if that sells it for you, The Devil Wears Prada meets Get Out, great, go for it. It's also just a wonderful book to read in its own right. It is very topical. Again, like Natasha Brown's Assembly, this is a book about systemic racism. It's about racial discrepancies and disparity in the workplace, in the modern American workplace, especially in industries that are primarily white and usually full of white women and run by white men. Again, I went over all of this in my video. If you want to actually know what The Other Black Girl is about, please check that video out. Next up is this, which I haven't mentioned yet because I have a video planned that this is going to feature heavily in. This is Sarah Waters' Fingersmith. Now, I am a huge fan of the films of Korean director Park Chan-wook. He did the Revenge trilogy, the most famous of those being Oldboy, and a few years ago he created a film called The Handmaiden. And The Handmaiden is actually a Korean adaptation of this novel. I knew that when I watched it, even though I hadn't read any Sarah Waters at that point, and I still hadn't until this month. I finally read Fingersmith. Fingersmith is her most famous novel. It's pretty big as well, it's a chunky book. And I love that film, I love historical fiction, and when people tell you, oh, you like historical fiction? Well, you need to read Sarah Waters. I finally did. Sarah Waters is a Welsh author who sets almost all of her books in and around the 19th century London. Fingersmith is a very, very beautifully written book. Not only does she set her characters and her world in the 19th century, but she sort of echoes that style of writing. The Brontes, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens. You can feel that gothic romantic style of writing that's all a little bit too wordy and flowery. It's here because it feels so authentically 19th century. I love that style of writing, and it's what really sold me on this. Even though the book is a little bit too long, it's worth it. It's absolutely worth a read. It is set in 3 different parts, and each of those parts wonderfully transforms and changes the entire thing. If you play video games and you've played Nier Automata, it's kind of like that. How every time you play through that game, it's a different story, it's a different world. It's kind of like that here. And if you have watched The Handmaiden, you need to read this. If you've read this and you haven't watched The Handmaiden, please watch that film. This is a book that I haven't actually finished with. I've been kind of dipping in and out of it now and again, sometimes when I'm just in bed and it's by my bedside. Whenever I have a chance, I read this. This is Laura Kate Dale's Gender Euphoria. Now, I'm a huge fan of Laura Kate Dale. I have been for years. She is a British trans woman who is best known as a video games pundit. She features heavily on Jim Sterling's podcast, The Podquisition, which I've been listening to now for like 4 years. I've been watching Jim Sterling's videos for about 10 years, and I read her first book, Uncomfortable Labels, which was a memoir about being gay, trans, and autistic, and now she has brought out Gender Euphoria, which is actually a collection of essays from transgender, non-binary, intersex, and otherwise non-cisgender writers all around the UK, and they've all featured their stories of gender euphoria here, stories of joy at being non-cisgender, because we always talk about gender dysphoria. As a non-cisgender, non-binary person myself, I struggle a lot with gender dysphoria. I continue to. It is a problem in my life. But I also do feel gender euphoria when my hair grows and I dye it, and when I'm wearing certain clothes or I wear makeup and I just feel a bit more comfortable in myself. I do feel gender euphoria, and we don't talk about the beauty of being non-cisgender enough, but here they do. There's a huge blend of writers here. Laura Kate Dale herself filled up this collection with her essays, so I think she takes up about a third of the book and the intro, and then the other 2/3 are a bunch of other essayists who've told stories of gender euphoria, and it is so warming. I love it. And I'm trying to chew on it really slowly, bit by bit, dipping in and out of it as kind of little pick-me-ups here and there, and it's working really nicely. This is Elena Nose by Claudia Pinheiro and translated from Spanish into English by Francis Riddle. Elena Nose is an Argentinian book. The titular Elena is a 60-something-year-old woman with Parkinson's disease whose daughter has just died. Her daughter was found hanged in the belfry of their local church, and it was definitely suicide. It was written off very quickly by the local police chief. Yeah, this was suicide. But Elena doesn't believe that. Elena knows. Elena knows the truth. Her daughter did not kill herself. I mean, she did. But Elena refuses to believe it. She refuses mostly because on the day that her daughter died, it was raining, and her daughter has had a lifelong fear of going near a church while it's raining because they work as lightning rods, and she doesn't want to get struck by lightning. And immediately when I saw that, I was like, well, if she's going there to kill herself, she's not going to be worried about getting struck by lightning. And I guess you're supposed to think that. This is a book about misunderstandings within family. It's a book about how families so often don't actually know each other, especially when older people, parents, grandparents, don't know the younger people in their family that well. I relate to this hugely. I'm relatively close to my parents. I'm an only child, but I am confident in saying that my parents don't actually know me. They have an idea of me from when I was younger that they latch onto, and whenever I say or do something that bucks that idea, they are so confused because I'm not being the person that they think I am. They don't know me. Not really. Not this me. And that's more or less what this book is about. So I really, really related to this. This is about Elena thinking she knows the truth about her daughter, while there's actually a whole other truth that she doesn't know. And as the book goes on, we get to understand Elena's truth, her daughter's truth, everything comes out, and it's a real page-turner. It's also very, very short and a really quick read. I'm not going to dwell on this for more than a minute because I'm going to do a full video on this. I have a video planned with my friend Jill, the book bully, who also has her own channel. I'll link to that in the description. And Jill and I are going to be doing a kind of buddy read of this. We've both read it. This is Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. Zauner? I'm not sure. Japanese Breakfast. Japanese Breakfast is a pop group, I guess. I love Japanese Breakfast. Their album Jubilee came out this year, and it's one of my favourite albums of this year so far. I love Japanese Breakfast. And their singer, Michelle Zauner, who is a Korean-American woman, has brought out this memoir. And it is harrowing. It is mostly about her relationship to her parents, primarily her mum, as her mum gets and dies of cancer. This was very triggering for me. I found this book very difficult to read. I cried. I read it over the space of a few days, and I struggled to get through it. As I said, I have health anxiety, and that was actually the main reason why. It wasn't really the stuff about her relationship to her mum that set me off. It was just all the disease talk that really, really triggered me, and I found it difficult to read. But as I said, I'm going to do a full video on this with Jill very, very soon. Finally, as you can see from the bookmark, I have not quite finished this book. I am about 100 pages away from the end, but I had to mention it, and I will probably feature it in a few videos going forward. This is N.K. Jemison's The Fifth Season. It is the first in a trilogy of incredible fantasy novels. I think all 3 books in this trilogy won a Hugo Award one after another, which is insane. When I did my Patreon book club the other day, almost everyone in the book club had actually already read this, so that was great. This is amazing. This is absolutely incredible. I'm realizing now that the video is going a bit long, so I shouldn't really dwell on it, and I am going to talk about it in more detail, but this is one of the most clever, ambitious, well-realized and well-written fantasy novels I have ever read in my entire life, and I'm saying that as a huge fantasy fan. It really is amazing. Hugo Award? Yeah, I get it, but I will talk more about it soon in an upcoming video. I can't wait to read the second and third ones, and I'm going to try and finish this one today. There you go, that's everything I read in July. I'll leave it there, this video is already too long. Subscribe for books.